Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to welcome you to this special evening. We have a special guest tonight, and I'm so excited to introduce you to Joe Brummer. Joe is an author and a speaker and an expert and a survivor and a passionate trauma-informed change maker. So we've invited him to our Trauma-Informed Change Makers book club and community to talk to you a little bit tonight about his work in the world, and we may have some questions and things, and we'll have a little discussion here. So welcome, Joe. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yes, yes. So first of all, wow, when I scheduled this with you, we were talking about, I was reading your book, we were talking about violence and how do we prevent that and what do we do to make our schools more trauma-informed. And then just recently we had this horrifying incident. And we've had many horrifying incidents over the last few months and years of violence in our schools and our public spaces. I think this topic is so, so important right now. People are just reeling and they don't really even know where to start. Where do we start to make the change that needs to happen? So I just want to acknowledge that this topic is so important. So those of you who are here, I really appreciate the time that you're taking to be here to talk about this topic. I hope that this will bring a little bit of hope, but maybe also some strategies and some things to think about. So let's talk about trauma-informed restorative practices, the title of your book. And let me, I have your book here somewhere. I'll hold it up here in just a minute, but you've written an amazing book that I'm going to make sure it was already on my list for the Trauma-Informed Change Makers. Some folks have seen that on the list. Guys, if you haven't read it yet, you need to grab it and read it because it really covers so many different aspects that are so important when we're setting up systems in our schools, when we're working with students and parents and teachers. It needs to be comprehensive and it needs to be more than just checking off a box, right? So Joe, if you will tell us a little bit, just give us a summary of why you think trauma-informed restorative practices are so essential in our schools today.
Look around you. We just had a school shooting.
Yeah.
We have literally just crazy stuff happening around us. And I don't think the average everyday person realizes the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and trauma and toxic stress on development. But we create so much of the problem. A lot of the problems that are around us are created through adverse childhood experiences and how we raise our children. And children are not our priority. And that is the problem. You could sum it up any way you want, but at the end of the day, we don't make children a priority. And so as they grow into adults thinking they don't matter, they don't, we end up with adults who are not as empathic as they could be, not as caring and listening and all the things we want them to be. And then you add a culture of hyper individualism, pull up your bootstraps, work hard, you'll succeed, versus build your team. That's what I wish the message was. Build your team. You don't succeed by yourself. You succeed with an army behind you.
Right? Be a human. Don't just do it to be productive. Right. There's a lot of emphasis on productivity, not a lot of emphasis on humanity, right? So where's the humanity?
It's missing.
Yeah.
And so that's why I believe, wholeheartedly, that we need trauma-informed schools. And then you put on top of that restorative justice as a way of thinking about people messing up, people breaking the rules, breaking laws. Restorative justice is a compassionate way of creating community. And a part of that means if you're going to build community, you have to maintain it, and things are going to go wrong. Harm is going to be caused. And restorative justice is a way for us to bridge that gap. So how do we repair harm, build communities that are relationship-based, respectful, culturally appropriate, all the things we would want out of relationships. It's
Absolutely.
also how brains develop.
Mhm.
And I don't want to leave that part out, because so many of our problems today are caused because we didn't put enough energy into protecting young mothers, family, and family not as in your nuclear, like, I'm not,
Sure.
but when I say the word family, I mean a much deeper word. And so we're not taking care of young mothers, we're not taking care of family, we're not doing paternal leave, we're barely giving maternity leave, and then we wonder why our kids are growing up and where they are.
Yeah.
And it reminds me, I don't know if you've ever been exposed to Stacey Patton's work, who
Tell me.
a woman who wrote, it's a shame I don't have the book like handy, it's actually in my book bag. I'm a really big fan of this woman, Stacey Patton, who wrote a book called Spare the Kids, which
Mm,
really addresses
right.
corporal punishment in Black families.
Spare the kids.
Yeah, but she makes this interesting case that I've really, really warmed up to, that we raise children and it comes from sort of like in her argument, and I'm not saying this is true, false, and different, but I like this argument. I
Mhm.
like this argument that says we raise white people and white children in ways that reduce, in cruel ways that reduce their ability to be empathic.
Right.
So of course they can go buy and sell people. Of course they can engage in racism and dehumanizing people,
Right.
because we raised people that do that.
Right. So
Here's
cut.
the key: we don't
So
have to do
competitive.
that.
Yeah.
We could change that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Start raising really empathic children that don't even would never think to buy and sell each other or slash each other's humanity, or and I think that argument is so incredibly strong that I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to start raising children that are capable of peace.
I love that. And it reminds me of a quote, and I'm trying to think of who said this, but it's we teach children things that are not important that are easy to measure instead of teaching children things that are important that are not easy to measure.
Right. I agree with that.
Because how can you do a state test on empathy, right? you know,
Right.
this is and this is all this about this productivity and what are we, as the industrial complex of the school, what are we producing? We're producing people who are really, by the time they get to high school, and I taught high school for about 8 years, but I taught in middle school and elementary as well. But when I was in high school, so many of those kids were checked out by the time they got to high school. They just don't care. They just don't want to be there. And so are they really learning what it is that we're trying to test them anyway? There's so much that needs to be changed, but I love that. I went and I'm going to grab her book and read that.
It's a tough read,
Yeah.
and yet
Well, it's important.
probably the most valuable book I've read in like a while,
Yes. Yes.
because it challenged me, and it challenged me to rethink, and she points out, and I will say bluntly, she's very blunt, and
Yeah.
she very bluntly points out how, European parenting practices
Yeah.
were literally brutal and
Yes,
cruel.
yes. And so Black and
15th
brown
century people
families
put the
have
death penalty.
taken those on in order for their children to survive in a white supremacist society. So it just
But then
perpetuates.
forcing Black parents to keep their kids protected. And so
Right. They have to.
Black parents needed their children to be compliant in the first time asked.
Right.
And so they raised their children in ways that
Right.
we forced them to.
Right.
And it's one of those deals where we created the conditions and then we blamed them for how they reacted. And
Right.
and I think that argument is probably one of the most impactful arguments I've read about how we should be raising children, how we could be changing things. But add to this, and I'm sure you read this in my book too, that, look at your addiction clinics. They're filled with traumatized people,
Oh
both
goodness.
Look at our prisons. They're
Prisons,
all
yeah.
filled with
Like
traumatized people.
99%. It's basically trauma
Trauma.
centric.
Trauma is everywhere. And not every person that's been traumatized will go on to be destructive.
Hmm.
But everyone that's been traumatized is struggling.
Yes.
And
Well,
that
and some
doesn't
of
help.
our kids who, we so often we talk about behaviors, right? And there's this whole behaviorist thing, which we'll talk about in a minute, but there are kids who are traumatized who fly under the radar because they're in
They're
freeze.
quiet.
They're
They're
in freeze,
quiet.
or they're being bullied, or they're just trying to be perfect. I mean, there's so many different kinds of ways that trauma express themselves. So
Mhm.
anyway, we could go on this topic forever, but I want to hear more about your story. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to write this book and to get into this work really in the first place. Like, what was your journey? Just a brief version of that.
The brief version of this is I'm a trauma survivor. Um, and as I've done the work, I've gotten more open about how much that really is a part of the work. Um, Ultimately, because I'm a trauma survivor and because I've survived 2 hate crimes, I've survived child abuse and bullying, and when I say bullying, I don't mean I mean
Brutal.
let's go back to 1980s, 1990s
Yeah.
cruelty,
Yeah.
and 1970s, 1980s cruelty, and so a lot of that drove me into work that was peace building work, and I ended up the associate director of a community mediation center, and so I'm to this day in my heart still a community mediator. I served 6 years on NAFCM's board, the National Association for Community Mediation. And so I'm a big supporter of community mediation. So my shout out to anyone doing this work that's a community mediator. But as part of that work, I was sent into schools to set up peer mediation programs. And quite frankly and bluntly, I hated listening to adults talk to children. They talk down to them. They talk just it made me nauseous the way I heard adults talk to children. And so I talked a principal at a school. I said, can I train your teachers in Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication? And she's like, yes, like do it. And I was like, I won't even charge you for it. Like I just want to do it. And so I went and I did it. And the teachers loved it. And the principal was like, bring more of this. And so I did. And I've been trained in restorative justice and I knew enough about trauma to start bringing some of that in. And simply enough, the assistant principal of that school left, went to another school, and the first thing she did was call me. And that was the story. So now I wasn't in one school, I was in two. And it
And now you're a
spiraled from there.
consultant once it's been two, right?
Eventually that, is,
Yeah.
I the funding for my position as an associate director was not really necessary anymore. They had an executive director. There really just wasn't a need for my position, and so they cut my position. And when I left, the schools were like, "Well, can we just pay you?" And I was like, "Well, I guess why not?" And
Yeah.
so I don't know what my next move is, and
Yeah.
that was apparently what the universe planned for my next move. And
That's
so I left my job in December 31st, and January 1st, I was like, okay, I guess I'm a consultant. And it's
wow.
never stopped from there. And so
Yeah.
January 1st, 2015, I became a consultant working for schools, and I haven't stopped since.
That's fantastic. That's kind of how I fell into this work. I started just talking to parents, other parents who were going through raising a child with trauma. My son was adopted. I don't know how much you know my story, but he had massive just the effects were so devastating to his whole soul and spirit and everything, right? So we just came through so much, and I didn't know what to do, and so I reached out to other people and did all the research and fell into the work, and then started talking to other parents, and they started asking me to come talk to them, and then it fell into this. So same thing, when there's a need and there's a huge need, people find you and then they ask you to come back. So that's fantastic. So tell us about what you mean when you say restorative practices, and when you're talking about restorative. Most of the people in this group know what trauma informed means, but tell us what restorative is. And I love this quote from the book. You said restorative is not something you do, it is something that you are within yourself. It is a way of being. So kind of explain that quote and how that informs the work that you do in schools.
I think, you know, trauma-informed and restorative practices have always had immense overlaps. But restorative justice is a way of thinking and seeing the world that focuses on relationship, not that different from the world of trauma-informed. Um, but it also sees that people are not disposable. You can't just get rid of them because they're not living up to your way of being.
Right.
And so our typical, you know, sort of traditions and our traditional systems send you away.
Right.
Restorative justice comes from indigenous thinking, where every single person in a tribe, every single person is a valuable member of the community. You don't just get rid of people because everybody is necessary.
Right.
And so I think for a lot of indigenous people across our globe, which this is a part of restorative justice that just like clicks in my heart. If you look at circle practice, which is a part of restorative justice, it's a part of this thinking and a restorative practice to be in circle. And you hear people talk about being in circle. But being in circle is, you know, we had tribes and clans and indigenous people across the globe for thousands of years who did not know of each other's existence, all with the tradition of circle.
Mm-hmm.
And those traditions were all very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can call this an indigenous practice, or we could call it what I think it is, human. Like we get in circle and suddenly everyone's equal. Everyone can be and teach and pass down tradition. I think there's just something so incredible about this way of thinking. But it's not just the circle. It's
Mm-hmm.
that way of being that says we're all interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
We're all wise and powerful, and we know what to do. We just have to allow ourselves to be that way. I think restorative justice is a way that values every single person for their heart. And it's just a way of being, and you can't turn that off. And so you can't say, I'm doing restorative practices, because what happens when you're not doing
Exactly.
it? So the reality of restorative practices and trauma informed is this notion that it's much what Gandhi said about nonviolence. It's not a cloak or a coat you could just take off and put on when you want to. Like either this is who you are and who you've become, or it's not.
Yes.
And for so many of us, that means changing the way we see everything,
Mm-hmm.
not just children's behavior. We have to rethink community, rethink commerce, rethink laws, because we have to acknowledge each other's interconnectedness. Because we love in our hyper individualized American way to be like, I don't care what he does, I'm just gonna worry about me.
Right.
Except that's not reality.
Right.
The reality is that we are all interconnected. And this pandemic showed us that more than anything, right? We're
Absolutely.
all like, I don't have to wear a mask, except you don't wear a mask, you kill 10 of your friends.
Exactly. And when you talked about everyone is part of the circle, everyone is part of the community.
Yeah.
Nobody is disposable. Nobody is able to be, we don't just remove people. Immediately I'm thinking about this school shooter who was expelled from school, and I guess everybody thought now we don't have to worry about him, and what are we doing? Where he still comes back to harm the community because the community has harmed him, you know?
What is that African proverb that you hear that
Yeah,
says, you know, that the child, you know, a child will burn down the village to feel its warmth, who's
exactly.
been
Yeah,
excluded, or I don't remember the whole
yeah,
exact of that, but or at least off the top of my head right this second. You know, we can either embrace the fact that people aren't disposable and that you have to take care of them whether you want to or not,
yeah,
because their well-being and your well-being are intertwined.
absolutely.
You're not going to escape that. And I'm sorry, I have to be worried about some strange guy in India right now, or some strange woman in Africa right now, because if one of them gets sick from a virus that we can't help them with, look what happens to that virus.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
like it's unexplainable to me how we see each other as so disconnected.
Absolutely.
but we are connected. Like what happens, what's a butterfly flaps its wings in
Right,
wherever,
right.
but that's true.
Yeah,
It's not,
yeah,
and you can wish it not true, but it is true.
yeah.
And that's what restorative justice is about. Now just put that into a school building, right? Every single person in that school building matters to how that school building will run. And this isn't like some philosophical way of being. This is neuroscience,
Right,
right? So we can step away from all the philosophical restorative justice. This is just neuroscience.
right.
Polyvagal theory looks at us and says, your brain is scanning for danger constantly. And it looks to other people through a phenomenon called flock. We look to each other for a reality check. So
Exactly.
like right now, if a smoke alarm went off, like I'm just sitting here in my little townhouse, but if a smoke alarm went off, there's a good chance I'd look to the other people in my little townhouse to say,
Mhm.
hey, are you worried about that? Or is this just like a fluke?
Yeah,
If they look all panicky, I'm going to panic. If they look kind of like, hey, what's this? I'm probably not going to panic. Like we read each other, and
yes,
that's how the world works.
yes.
And so in a school building, if you have a couple dysregulated adults, they'll just dysregulate all the kids.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, and this is
So
what for
we're
parents as
connected.
well. Yeah, and
We're
parents
just
that are
connected.
dysregulated are dysregulating their children, and so
Yeah,
if they grow up in that environment and that's what the mirror neurons are doing, that's what they're going to become, right? Wow,
exactly.
this is so, and I love this idea of we're changing to become something, not to do something new.
Right.
Because I see so many, so now social emotional learning is the big buzzword, and trauma informed, and let's get a trauma informed curriculum and a social emotional learning package, and let's pass out worksheets, and then we've done that,
Yeah.
That's not the way to do it. And I'm always telling my folks in the program when I train them to really, really push back against that mentality that this is just something that's one more, a standardized curriculum that we're going to test kids on, on how well they're regulated. Like we're going to check that off. So tell us a little bit more when you talk about circle. What does circle look like? We've talked about indigenous communities and the importance of that and the interconnectedness. How do you see circle being an important part of the culture and climate of a school? And how
It
does it
builds community. So, the first thing that we need in a school, and putting it in light of these shootings, right? We have these shootings, we have these tragedies that happen, and suddenly we become, after the Boston Marathon bombing, we were all Boston strong.
right?
Now we have this latest shooting, and we're strong for that community. Like we always just like pick the name of the place and add strong on the end of it because something happened.
Right.
But the concept of circle in a school is to become strong community before the tragedy, not after.
Right.
And because you can do that, you prevent these things. These things are preventable in communities by
Right.
holding people close and bringing them in and building relationship. So a trauma-informed restorative school is really a school that is relationship-based. People matter more than everything else. No curriculum, no discipline code matters more than the people. All of them, down to the custodian staff, to the lunch crew, to everyone matters. And when you have a community like that, you're strong.
Yeah.
And strong communities will raise strong children who will then become strong adults. And while that concept seems so simplistic and like this isn't rocket, that's what I was kind of smiled
Yeah.
to myself. I'm like, this isn't rocket science.
Yeah.
But the reality is somehow people have made it rocket science. And so how do we go into a school and create these relationships? And circle is a restorative practice. It's not a borrowed practice. So oftentimes people think that we're doing indigenous work, or we're not. We're borrowing concepts and ideas. And so circle can really be a way of creating community where every voice matters, where everyone gets a chance to talk, and no one's at the head of the circle. There isn't one. Everyone's equalized. And so that builds equity, it builds voice, and it allows every student, every adult, every person in a school building to have voice on how that building runs, to equalize power, to equalize privilege, to equalize, how we see each other. In a school, we have to partner that up because circle practice, respect agreements, all of these things are not in restorative justice and in restorative practices by itself is not inherently trauma informed. Mm-hmm. But if you add those elements together, now you've got something powerful. So restorative practices and restorative justice were powerful to start with because of the way they see the interconnectedness of people.
Right.
A concept that in the trauma-informed world, we talk about the power of relationship, but not nearly on the level that restorative justice folks are talking.
Right.
And so bring these two worlds together into one world. You've got a world who understands state-dependent functioning, neuroscience, relationship, nurturing brains, and a group of people who understand that every relationship is interconnected. Yeah. All right, this is powerful. Let's bring this all together into one little package. And that's what I tried to do in the book, was to try and bring this world together. So let's have restorative practices like circle, respect agreements, restorative language. Let's use these practices to build strong communities. Yeah. So that strong communities raise strong children.
Absolutely. And I love this concept of prevention. And it's not even just preventing bad things, it's preventing children graduating as being not humane to one another. It's preventing, this inhumanity that we started the talk with. This idea of what are we building, what capacities and strengths and skills are we building in these humans that we're going to be eventually graduating from this system. Right. That all happens in this kind of a system that's restorative and connected and community based. Because if we're not doing that, then, what are we doing? When we used to I used to teach in Ohio, and it was all about the Ohio graduation test, right? Everything all year long was about passing that test. And I just wanted to know, how do we measure what I think is more important to measure, and I don't think those tests are always measuring that. And so if that's the complete emphasis of a school and we're not looking at the whole child, we're not looking at that human being that we're going to be sending out into the world, then what are we doing? It goes back to what's the point of school, right? What are we doing? So this is so powerful and so important for us to really take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and then dismantle everything and build it back from the ground up with the voices of all the people that have not been heard for so long, right?
So it's a big switch to go from this thinking of, and so our culture is very embedded in hyper-individualism.
Right.
You work hard, you'll succeed.
Right.
And by the way, that's the only goal. Get into a good college,
get a good job,
work really hard, make sure you get a good job, make sure you buy a big house. It's all you.
Yes.
But that's not community.
Right.
And we need communities to live.
Right.
And so what's lacking in our school systems right now is, how do kids succeed in the context of community?
Right.
In other words, if you're going to succeed, don't tell me what that does for you. Tell me what that does for us.
Right.
And we miss that. And I don't think anybody said it better than, and whether you're a fan or not a fan of Anthony Fauci, I thought his comment were in a press conference that he was doing about COVID. And he said, I don't know what to tell you to make you understand you have to care about each other.
Yeah.
I just sat there and I listened to that and I was like, oh God, yes.
That's a lot of, yeah.
What do you need to hear to recognize that you need to wear a mask, not for you, but for everybody else?
And I want to say this, that goes for both sides of the aisle in any political issue, because the dehumanization is happening on both sides. Let's just throw that out there. Because, I'm very, I have my views, but I'm seeing even people that I agree with politically saying horrible things about people that they disagree with. I'm like, wait a minute, that's still a human being. We really need to come back to this idea of community. And, where is that going? That polarization. But yeah, that's a talk for another day. But definitely, if we can start with the children, maybe there's some hope for building this as part of the DNA of how we do things, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Ooh, yeah. So let's talk about let's talk a little bit about behaviorism. And this idea of, we talked about productivity not being the goal is community. But when we're looking at what kids are doing and then what happens as a result of what they do, in most schools, there's what's called a code of conduct. And it's a very rules based and consequence based system that has that, I was always told as a teacher, we had to spend the first day of class in every class going over that. Like going over, here's the rules, here's the punishment that goes with it. And kids were, by the end of the day, that first day of school, they were just like, are we ever going to do anything but talk about the rules, And then the rest of the year, we were constantly reinforcing the rules, and we would have, I don't know, it just felt really oppressive in a lot of ways. And I found that I didn't necessarily not use that, but I tended to go away from it over time as I learned. Not, and I didn't know about trauma-informed, like I didn't know that word in the early part of my career. But I realized that going with that rewards and consequences mentality was not effective for many of my students. And over time, I realized it wasn't effective for most of them, but some of them just complied because whatever, they didn't care. And I just would, I'd have my rules on the board, but I didn't refer to that very much. We just had relationships, and I would take them in the hall and have conversations, and we'd restore the whatever was going on. We'd just have a talk about it and resolve it and have collaborative problem solving, those kinds of things. But what can we do to sort of shift this mindset? Again, it's sort of a collective thing, but as teachers and as parents and as teacher and parent leaders, how can we help to shift from this, consequence-minded, rules-based, prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline kind of a paradigm? I mean, that's a big question, but how can we change the world and make it a better place? Briefly,
first off, we have to want it.
2-minute answer.
we have to want it. Like that's the first part of my answer. We have to want it, and I don't know that we do. I think we are so entrenched in these ideas of behaviorism that why change? This is how we've always done it, kind of thinking. So here's the thing: the 1990s came, and George Bush, called them the decade of the brain. And the reason for that is because we had the introduction of the Fmri machine, which allowed us to start looking at the brain in real time and watch it develop and see how it functions. We, for the first time, got to see what an infant's brain looks like versus a 30-year-old brain versus a 20-year-old brain, and getting to realize that they don't develop the way we thought. They don't work the way we thought. And so we began to see clearly as a society that the things we're doing for children don't add up. And so our behavioristic way of thinking was that a child uses their behavior to either get something or get out of something. So I'm going to use my behavior to either get what I want or to get out of something I don't want. Except kids don't actually do that. It requires way more access to the frontal cortex than children actually have.
Until they're about 25.
Yeah. And so in order for you to see a child as using their behavior to get out of stuff and get stuff, you have to see a child as really conniving and manipulative. And it's a really dark view of children.
Yeah, I tell parents, like, they really don't get up in the morning and have like a chart on their wall. How can I push all of mom's buttons today? I'm going to do this and this. Like, they really don't do that, because parents come to me, they say, he knows how to push my buttons. Like, he really doesn't. I
wasn't much of a Family Guy fan, but I have to say I love Stewie. Because that's exactly isn't Stewie what we think kids are like? Conniving, scheming.
Oh, right. Yes, exactly.
They talk with a British accent. Like, come on, that's perfect.
Yeah.
But it's not realistic.
That sophisticated. They're really not. They really they're just reacting to their own nervous system state, right? That's all it is.
When we get realistic about children, then we start to realize what Ross Greene realized a long time ago, what Carl Rogers realized a long time ago, what William Glasser, this is, there was a handful of psychologists out there that said, wait, I think there's something more here. And I think your biggest one was Albert Bandura, social learning theory. Well, either you're a Skinner fan or you're a Bandura fan, but you can't be both.
Yeah.
Like that's really the reality here. And
Well, and I thought
Bandura said
it works for the short term. Like for the short term, you can get kids, their butts will be in their seats for like the hour that you're teaching them because they're afraid. And you can do it in the short term. And
it's compliance based.
that's why it's evidence based. That's why all these programs that are so evidence based, they can claim that because yeah, it quote works in the short term, but you're cutting the dandelions off, right? You're not looking at the root of the issue. You're not teaching them any kind of executive function skills. You're not teaching them any kind of relationship
Behaviorism is adult focused.
Yes, exactly.
It gets what you want for obedience and compliance.
Yeah.
And has nothing to do with the developing brain of a child.
Thank you.
I don't know why people can't deal with that.
Somebody write that down.
The problem in schools is that we've really relied on behaviorism so far that now we have entire systems like PBIS
right.
and responsive classroom and a bunch of other ones that are just focused on this idea that you could use rewards and punishments to get what you want. But the reality is that doesn't work for every kid. Yeah. And the kids that it works for don't actually need it. And the kids that it fails really do because they're traumatized, they're neurodiverse, they have special needs. Like, so the kids that it's not working for are the kids that really need the supports.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know those people will argue 6 ways to Sunday how behaviorism will help those kids. But the reality is most of the schools using heavy behaviorism also have higher use of seclusion and restraints.
Exactly.
And so who are we helping?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, you can't punish anxiety out of someone.
No.
You can't punish autism out of someone. You
also can't punish, you can get a kid to be compliant, but the kids that really won't be compliant and want to put up a fight with you, it's because they're going through stuff that's bigger than you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and they usually end up, if they can survive all of this, they end up being world leaders, and they're really awesome people. Like if they're being non-compliant and a little unconventional as a child isn't really helpful in our behaviorist society. But as adults, those are the innovators. Those are the people who have ideas that are outside the box. So we should be encouraging that, I think. Ross Green does that too, but yeah. Now I've grown to love that about my son. He has, and he knows I share all of these stories. He's come on to share some of his stories too, but he's not going to do what he's not going to do, period. And I've learned, from early on, I realized that. I'm like, I'm not going to restrain him. I'm not going to do, because he's just not going to do that. And I'll just wait until he decides what he's going to do, what he's going to do, and 9 times out of 10, he knows what's best for him. And so we work through it. We have discussions and we have collaboration, and that's how we roll. And it's so much more peaceful and it promotes so much more growth and autonomy and empowerment and all the good things that we want for our children.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about successes, because we're talking about all the things that they're doing wrong in schools, right? I'm actually, and when you said this about, how do we change the behavior, how do we change adult behavior, right? Because it's the adults that have the behavior problem from a trauma-informed perspective. In fact, I made a tongue-in-cheek behavior chart for my child's teacher once, and I posted it, and it got a lot of attention. But it was basically, why aren't we tracking what adults are doing all day, every day, and giving them little happy notes and stickers and things when they're actually being trauma-informed and connecting with my child? I mean, it's, as adults, we don't want that. We don't want people breathing down our necks either. But how can we change a more relationship-based system, right? But what are you seeing out there in the consulting world? And I'm seeing some of this in some of the Facebook communities I'm part of, and some of the discussions I have with teacher friends and parent friends. I'm seeing a little bit of a shift, seeing some positive things happening. I think that we need much more. But what are some of the successes that you've seen either in individual schools that you've worked with or just on a more general scale?
I mean, I mean, my first success right now, we have Miguel Cardona. Like, I'm sorry, that's a success to me. Like, here's a
Explain,
man.
if people don't know what
So
you mean.
Miguel Cardona is our current Secretary of Education. He comes from Meriden, Connecticut, a school system. You know, Miguel Cardona hired me to work with the Meriden Public Schools back in 2015, 2016. I'm not exactly
He
positive
spoke
what
at
year it was.
ATN recently, right?
He did. He spoke at ATN. He was
Yeah,
fantastic,
fantastic. Yeah.
and I always joke about that because one of the ways we got him to speak there is because he and I were supposed to do a presentation together at the very first ATN Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools
By the way,
conference.
that's for those of you who don't know, that's Attachment Trauma Network.
Yeah,
Some of them are
fantastic.
adoptive families like
I
mine.
plug them all the time because I think they're awesome.
Yeah.
But they're also really hardworking. And so they had their first Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools conference, and I was, invited to put a proposal in. And so I put a proposal in with Miguel. And,
Fantastic.
and at the very last minute, he's like, oh, there's too many things going on. I can't go. And I'm like, so I have to go do this presentation by myself. And it was like one of my first conference presentations. And I was like, oh, I don't really even know what I'm doing. And I
Yeah.
pulled it off and was invited back the next year to do like a 3-hour thing. But I was like, later on, when we wanted him as a keynote, I was like, hey, you remember that conference you ditched me on? I need you to come talk.
I need to get my, yeah, you owe me
Yeah.
one.
I'm sure there's a lot more to it. I mean, it's a great conference, and it was a great opportunity for him as Secretary of Education to be able to really reach educators, because we have a really large. I mean, that's 4,000 people came to the virtual conference, and so it was an opportunity for him to really talk. But I think the fact that he's an educator who's done this work,
Yeah.
like that's it's not that he's just an educator. He's an educator who implemented trauma-informed restorative practices in his school district with success. And still to this day, 4 or 5 years later, whatever, 7 years later, there's still restorative practices and there's still this work going on. And so that right there, I think, is a huge success. And the fact that we have someone in leadership pushing trauma-informed is immense. And recruiting
Is he
teachers.
able to though? Because when I went, I think you and I were both invited to that meeting when we met with one of his assistants.
Right. Yeah, I
And
didn't get to the meeting.
she was like, yeah, okay, good. And she asked for success stories. So I did this little PowerPoint and told my story. And, somebody from ATN, everybody did their little presentations. And I kind of got the feeling from her at the end that they hear us like that whole, we hear you, but we also have these other people lobbying for being more strict and being more, cracking
Right.
down on all of that. And so
Yeah.
they have to somehow please everybody. But are you seeing, do you have a behind the scenes look at anything that's changing on the federal level right
I,
now?
I mean, I think there are some things that they're in the works, and I can't name all those things. And I think, Miguel did talk in the keynote speech that he was doing about that they're setting up teacher recruitment programs in high schools, which I think is just such a fantastic idea.
Please recruit more Black and brown teachers because that drives me crazy.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, I think equity is part of his lens. Equity was part of his lens when I worked with him back when he was an assistant superintendent. And then he went on to become commissioner of education in Connecticut, and equity was still part of his lens. But he's going to have to start, he's going to have to toe the administrative line of
Right.
the party he represents.
Right.
That's just politics. But at the end of the day, I know that guy's heart. Like, I've spent hours talking with him about this work, and I know his heart is in it. That I think is our first biggest success story, but also in individual schools too. Here in Connecticut, we have a bunch of school districts that have been working on restorative practices, trauma informed, in pockets, some of them really like putting their energy into it. We have some amazing successes happening in school districts here in Connecticut, but also I think across the nation, we've seen Oakland public schools with restorative practices. And while they've had struggles up and down, they're still doing better than other people. Denver public schools doing amazing stuff with restorative practices. Minnesota, I mean, just endlessly, we have rock stars out there doing amazing work. Nancy Reisenberg, Kathy Evans, the teacher prep program at Eastern Mennonite University is giving people certificates and graduate programs in trauma-informed and restorative practices. Like, there is really amazing stuff happening. And so we can focus on all the negative stuff that we see in the world. We could also focus on there's really some foundational stuff happening in the world of trauma-informed and restorative practices, teacher prep programs across the nation, and Canada, Australia. We're teaching,
Yes.
in teacher prep programs, we're teaching this work. And so I think within time, this will just be the way education goes. And
I
so I
hope.
often tell people that in my workshops. I'm like, if you, because I've had a couple like educators who I've watched run from district to district, thinking they're going to outrun this stuff. They're not. Like,
Yeah.
every district is going to be doing this work.
They're trying to leave and not be trauma informed. Is that what they're trying to do?
I think they just don't buy in. They buy into
Oh,
behaviorism, that
wow.
when kids are bad, you punish them. Like,
Right.
you're bad, get out of my school. And it's like, yeah, kids aren't disposable. You can't just keep kicking your kids out.
Yeah.
And the research shows that when you do
Academically
that, it hurts
too.
the other kids.
Yeah, I can't
So
even stand. I mean, I'm an IEP mom. I'm a mama bear. I've
yeah,
been in all the IEP meetings, and they do this behaviorally, but they also do it academically. Kids are not, if they're not up to par, get out of my school because we don't want you to bring our test scores down. It's the same thing. So
right.
we've got to make. Why can't we make the school report card based on things like how trauma informed are you? Why don't we
Yeah.
can make the school report card based on, hey, sweetie, you come in. Speaking of my son, go ahead. Yeah, okay. Just kidding.
I would even add to that I would
Yeah,
just give a plug there for
yeah,
individual teachers, individual administrators. Like, I think our teachers are trying to do
yeah,
the best things they can do. I
yes,
think administrators have their hands tied.
yeah,
I think many administrators don't want to suspend kids for the things they suspend kids for, but their hands are tied.
right.
And so I think a lot of the work that we need to do right now is at a policy level. And we've got to start changing. And I think, I talk about this in my book, and I talk about it in workshops. We have to understand the difference between policy and procedure.
Right.
Like, policy might be written in stone, but procedure is how you carry out policy. And you
Yeah,
got a little bit of flexibility there. So how about you leave that kid in his classroom and keep him learning? And,
yeah,
I think that there's room to play. Um,
absolutely.
and,
Yeah,
and we're not doing that.
yeah, I agree with that. And I just think that there are people, like you said, there are individual teachers and administrators who are phenomenal, who are making a difference every single day. And that needs to be noticed and appreciated and lifted up. And we need to focus on that because, like you said, what we focus on is what's going to grow. So let's focus on that and let's elevate those stories and let's tell those stories more and more. And I think people will come along board. And I'm a member of a lot of little groups for behaviorist people because I just want to know what's going on. And so I hang out in those groups just to see. And every once in a while, I'll throw some trauma informed thing out there. People are hungry for the information. They really are. And so I think
Oh yeah.
if we can start to, in a collaborative way, right? Not in an accusatory way, like you bad behaviorist, you. How about like, here's something else that works. Here's something, try this. Come to my classroom and you'll see how this works. And this is how I train all my trainers and my coaches. Like, you need to use these collaborative things that we're talking about. We're teaching kids. We need to be that way as adults too. To instead of calling people out, we need to call them in to this
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
thing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll have some time for questions. And gosh, I know we
Sure.
can talk forever and ever, but let's talk about people that are on this call or that are in the Facebook group that are watching who are actually either already doing training for their fellow teachers or training for other parents. There, we have parent coaches who do this work,
Hmm.
and we have trainers who want to go into schools and support, their colleagues. What are some things that you told us your story of how you got into it. What are some things that they should know about, going into organizations or schools and being effective as a trauma-informed change maker, as somebody who wants to be a trainer or help other people?
Wow. Yeah. It's funny because if you'd asked me this like 5 years ago versus today, I think my answer would be so different.
Oh, wow. Tell us about that. What would
But
the answer have been then and what would it be now?
I think, years ago, I would have been like, do anything you can to get your foot in the door
Mm-hmm.
and do the work. And now I would tell you, look, if you don't have top leadership talking to you, walk away.
Mm.
Because I've been at this now for 7 years. I'm a one-man show. I don't have like a team. I have some consultants that I can pick on to like help me out with a larger project or larger school systems. And I'm definitely expanding that as I go. Um, but oftentimes I get into school systems and like I never meet the superintendent. Like I'm working with 30 of your schools and I've never met you.
Wow.
And then I find that they're like basically working against me. And I'm like, hey, you brought me to your school system to make change. And you're basically one, hiding from me, and two, not working with me, and in fact, working against me.
Wow.
Like, how is that
So
going to work?
who hires you? Like if the superintendent doesn't even know you're there, doesn't care that you're there,
I
are
think
they really
oftentimes
doing
the
you?
assistant superintendent might bring me, or if it's a large school district, sometimes it's like the climate and culture team
Gotcha.
brings me in, but the superintendent's doing something else.
So they're box checking now. Okay, we did climate culture. We're
and
done with that.
I've definitely learned over the last few years about like really thinking about like how much do I want to bang my head against the wall
Yeah.
and try to get into things. And I had this really good friend years ago when I first got into this work, and I was not doing it in schools. I was
Mhm.
doing the same messaging and the same work. I was just doing it in organizations.
Right.
I was doing it for Fortune 500 companies, teaching nonviolent communication, restorative thinking. I mean, I wasn't always doing this in schools, and I still don't just do it in schools. I do it in juvenile justice work, and we're doing a lot of work with diversion programs here in Connecticut in juvenile justice work, which I also strongly believe in doing that work as well. And so it seems like I'm only doing things in schools, but I'm actually doing a lot of juvenile justice work too.
It's
And
fantastic. Yeah.
I think what's really become important to me is like how we do the work. And
Hmm.
I've really come to this place where I've always tried to do this work in the spirit of this work. So I'm super
Hmm.
flexible about my fees. I'm super flexible with people. And sometimes I've learned that I can't always get away with that. Like I have to play the world's game because they're not going to play mine. And that's
Wow.
been hard. It's been
Yeah.
really hard because it literally means I have to go against my own values and beliefs
Yeah. I've got
just
a
so I can put food on my table.
exactly. I have, and I don't know if she's watching right now, but one of my trainer graduates told me that she had applied for a position within their school and they were 100% PBIS and they wanted her to come help with this trauma-informed initiative in their PBIS system. And she was like, she was trying so hard to go to this interview and make an impression, but she didn't get the job because her heart wasn't in it because she's like, I just don't believe in what they're doing. So it's tough
Yeah,
when you
that's
have
a
to
tough
get a
one.
job, like you need the job, but you got to decide, is my philosophy in alignment with this, and am I going to, for my own self-care, for my own trauma-informed preservation of myself, can I go there?
It's one of the disconnects between the trauma-informed schools movement
Yeah.
and the restorative justice in schools movement
Yeah.
is that restorative justice in schools people want to work with the PBIS people.
Right.
Somehow they don't get it in the restorative justice world that stuff's not trauma informed.
Right.
That stuff's
Interesting.
never going to be equitable.
That's interesting.
It's
Wow.
you can't make PBIS trauma informed. It
Yeah.
is simply impossible.
Yeah.
And I, I know there are people out there saying, "Oh no, it's trauma informed." The only
Yeah.
people that say PBIS is trauma informed are the people who are profiting off PBIS.
Yeah.
Let's be clear about that. So of course they're going to tell you it's. But the fact of the matter is, punishments and reward systems are going to add stress to a traumatized brain.
Yes.
That's never going to be trauma
And I
informed.
call them shadow punitive. Even positive rewards it's a shadow punitive system because the point is that at some point they're not going to get the reward, right? And that is a punishment. When you withhold
Right.
the reward, it ends up having the same effect as a punishment. And we know what punishment does to kids' brains, and we need to stop doing that. So yeah, yeah, and I tell this to my parent coaches, those of you parent coaches who are watching, I tell them don't take on clients who are not on board with this kind of system. because you are just going to really be frustrated and discouraged because they're not going to get it. You can teach a class or do a workshop or something where they can come and participate. But if you're going to do deep dive work with somebody, either as a coach or as, like you said, as a consultant with a larger organization, you've got to have the buy-in from the get-go, or else it's just, like you said, you're going to be beating your head.
And I'm totally open to like educators who are behaviorists who are open to thinking differently.
That's the difference. Like somebody
you're
who's
open to it,
open-minded and they're like, hey,
rock on.
I'd love to learn. You know, they're open
Yeah.
to learning, but some people are they're like, nope, this is the way it's got to be, and then you got to stay with it.
I often, so the way that I work with schools is I do a 6-day training that's broken up into these 2-day blocks. And I've had people go through that training and really dive into trauma-informed behaviorism, discipline. What is punishment? What is a consequence? What's accountability? What's discipline? Let's define these things.
Right.
And after those 6 days of really examining the work, I've had so many behaviorist-minded folks come back to me and be like, "Now I'm done with that stuff."
Wow.
And
that's great.
I have collections of emails.
Not converts.
And so like those are what I read when I'm depressed.
That's
like,
good. Well, see, that's the thing. If you make a
work,
difference for that, it's like the starfish story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, there's a million starfish on the beach dying, and if you toss one in the ocean, you've made a world of difference for that one starfish. So I say the same thing about, you know, because we're doing, some of my parent coaches, I mean, they might only have 1 or 2 clients to start with, and they feel like, is this really making a difference? But it's making a difference. Trust me, it is. Any little shift that you make, any little change, any little move towards more relationship-based, more trauma-informed, more neurosystem, you know, understanding how the brain and the body actually work.
Yeah.
If a parent or a teacher starts to get that and realize that, oh, they really aren't they aren't manipulating me, and they're not, it's actually, they're terrified.
I think once parents and educators understand state-dependent functioning, so if you have to go Google that after this, do it.
Look up my people know this. They know the polyvagal, they know all the things. I
mean, it's more of a Bruce Perry's neurosequential model.
Right.
But when you understand how the brain functions, how the brain is structured, and the architecture of the brain,
right,
I'm sorry, you will clearly see how behaviorism is harmful. Yeah. It's not that it doesn't work or it's not really in the work. It's harmful. Yeah. And all you need to do is understand how the brain is structured, how it develops. It develops basically from the inside, from the bottom up, and from the inside out. Yeah. And when you understand the functioning of that, you understand that the higher order thinking that makes you is at the top of the food chain. Yes. And it's got to go through, every piece of information's got to go through all those layers first, which means at any given moment, we could be thrown into a different state.
Yes.
And when you're in those higher states of fight, flight, freeze, faint,
yes,
your cortex is no longer open for business. It's no longer open for learning.
Oh yeah, it's the flipped lid and all that. I use a Slinky here at Heartstrong. We use
that works.
The spiraling stages, and like there's expansive and growth, and then there's you know, your nervous system is gonna shut down, and this is human. Like this is much more human, and we're gonna have good days and bad days, and we can't expect children to be perfect, just like we can't expect adults to be perfect. It's just the way it's gonna be, but. Yeah, so important. Have you ever played the brain architecture game? That's a really good.
I haven't. I've seen that.
It's really good.
I've never done it.
We used it. I used to do parent education for an agency that worked with biological parents whose children had been removed, and they were mandated by the court to take parent classes to get their children back. So I was doing parent training for them and some other things in that agency, but they started to get it, like the adverse childhood experiences and how they affect the brain. And like, we've got to protect those babies' brains, you know? And so we really focused on that in our parent ed, but our time is like I said, we could talk for hours, but I want to open up for questions. And before we do that, if you'll just share how people can follow you, and if you have any special events or anything that you'd like to let our audience know about before we have question and answers.
So special event is that I'm the keynote, I'm the closing keynote at the Restorative Justice and Education Conference the end of this month with Eastern Mennonite University. And so if you look up Eastern Mennonite University's Restorative Justice and Education program, you can register for that conference. It's a virtual conference. It's, I think, 3 days. And the opening speaker is Cheryl Wilson from the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. And then I'm the closing keynote speech. It'll only be my second one ever. So
You're going to do
give me
fabulous
grace
job.
if I'm terrible. You know, so they can do that. And then there's also, you can always find me at my website, joebrummer.com. There's nothing really to buy there, but there's some free downloads and some great articles that I've written over the years.
Hold your book up. I have it. Oh, I've got it. Here it is. I gotta make sure everybody knows about the book. Make sure you all get a copy.
Behind me down there, but
yeah, it's behind him, but it's Building Trauma-Informed Restorative Schools. So everybody make sure you get that book. It's really, really well done. I really appreciate your
and be sure to read the foreword by Judy Atkinson, who the story about the little ninja is just so freaking amazing. I just love that story. And so if you do read the book, or you've read the book but you didn't read the foreword, go back and read Judy Atkinson's foreword. She's amazing. The foreword, I mean, she's an amazing human. She's an Indigenous professor from Australia, and she's just amazing. And that story about the little ninja is really an awesome story.
I love that. And just speaking of amazing things, like there's so many charts and diagrams and ideas and like visuals that are just so practical in here. So it's not just theory, it's really how to put the theory into practice. And I love books that are like that. And so I've got it all marked up. I'm like, yes, star. I like to do that with my books. And I love that you're talking about international, getting this out to other countries too. It's not just about the US, right? We have Canadians in our group. We have somebody, I don't know we have one from a New Zealander in our group. We've got a couple of people from, I think we have somebody from the UK who's going to be joining us soon. So hello to everybody.
The book was published in 5 countries.
Awesome.
So it's published in the US, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and Australia.
Fantastic. So you all can grab it if you haven't already. Make sure to do that anywhere, and they can follow you on Twitter and Instagram.
So Twitter's easy, at Joe Brummer.
Yeah.
You can find me on Facebook too. I'm sort of trying to work my way away from Facebook a little bit, but you can always find me on Twitter, which I spend a little too much time on there searching the news to find out what's going on in the world. Since I gave up watching the news, now I just
yeah. I heard somebody say it was Abby Wambach. I don't know if you follow Glennon Doyle and Abby, but Abby said, don't watch the news, be the news. Go out and make the world better and be the news.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what you're going to do, Joe. You're not watching it. You're going to be it.
I'm going to try real hard.
Be the good news, right? All right. Well, let's open this up to our audience on Zoom. I hope all of our audience members will participate with questions. And you can unmute yourself or type in the chat if you have a question. Elena has a question. Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great. I've been taking notes. I promise I'm paying attention. If I'm looking down, it's just because I'm like writing everything down. And I can't wait to read your book. I have not had a chance to grab that yet, but going into a school, how do you approach going into a school? So the superintendent, the head of special ed are very familiar with myself or my family just because we have a lot of kids and I'm very active in the school district. But how do you go into a school approaching the school? What is your kind of method of selling this to a school that thinks they're trauma informed and do restorative practices, but really doesn't?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I feel blessed in the fact that I don't really have to sell it to schools. Usually if they've come to me, it's because they've already decided this is what they want to do. But then there's the whole process of getting them to look at what they're already doing and that they've already invested their time into, and saying, well, some of what you're doing is not actually trauma informed. Some of what you're doing is not really restorative. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite. And so And again, it's another one of those questions that if you'd asked me this like in 2015, my answer would have been very different than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do believe that, one, if you're going to go into a school, the principal needs to be your lead. If you're going to go into a district, you need the superintendent. You need to have at least one conversation with the superintendent to know that you have an open line of communication.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's really crucial to making change. I think the second piece of it is you have to know who your key players are, both at the school level and at the district level. So if you're going to be working with just a school, it's a one school project, then know who your key players are. Who's your team? And this is on my website too, on the restorative justice page, like who's the team? Because the reality is, as consultants, I'm not in the day-to-day of your school. I'm not in the day-to-day of your district. And so there's lots of stuff I do not know.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple. I don't know, and I'm not exposed to it. And so I can't help you. But your team, they know. There are people that know. I will tell you the number one person you want on your team in a school is the front desk. Like I'm not lying to you. This is the person.
As a former teacher, I would agree with that. Yes.
Like the front desk person in school knows the delivery people, knows the parents, knows the teachers, knows the principal. They know everybody, and they watch how the school functions. They know the kids that get sent to the office all the time. They just know everything. And they rarely get asked to participate in implementation projects like this. And so they will go all out. I can tell you that every front desk person I have ever worked with was so just ecstatic that we wanted their input. Mm-hmm. They gave it everything. And it really mattered to the success of those schools. Shout out to the John Barry School in Meriden, who their front desk person just blew me away and solidified my thinking about, like, you need the front desk at your working with you, because they just know so much. But then after that,
custodians are really important too. They know a lot.
Custodians are amazing. Mm-hmm. They sometimes know a lot about the school. They tend to have influence over some of your tough kids.
Well, they're good friends with the administrators, because the administrators need to ask them to do things all the time. So they're like the good.
I think, and if we're doing this work, we have to remember it's relationship-based work, right? And so those are relationships. Those are, like, you don't just have a learning community, you have a community. There are people involved in that community that you might not think are, part of that community. I have a really good friend of mine years ago that I worked with that told me that he had gone to a school and he'd asked the custodian about his job, and he said, I'm one of the most important people here because kids can't learn in a dirty building.
That's great.
And I was like, wow, that's profound. And so, don't forget your custodians. But I think when you go into a school, you have to acknowledge as a consultant that you don't know that school, and you never will. You don't work there. You don't get to know the gossip. You don't know who gets along with who, and those things actually do matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really think it's important that we rely on the community, that we trust community wisdom. Like, the people who will help you do this work the best are the people who are in that community. Mm-hmm. So go talk to the teachers, go talk to the paras, go talk to the custodian, go talk to the people in that building and say, hey, what do I need to know about this building to make change? The answers that you get will not only feed your soul a little, but they will also help you do the work. And I think I've really learned over the years that that's important. I would also not, and this is hard work, this is the hard work. When I get into a school and I find the people that are pushing back at me the hardest, my temptation is to not like them and to be like, oh God, they're giving me a headache. Mm-hmm. But yet those people have valuable concerns. Mm-hmm. And when you really address those concerns and you talk with them and you take the time to hear them out and connect with them and let them feel seen, heard, and valued, the wisdom they will bring you is amazing. And two, when you get them on your side, it is a score. It is a home run.
Yeah.
because they are going to be your biggest. I remember years ago, I worked with a principal. He was part of a 6-day training with 5 other schools. And from day one, this principal rolled his eyes at me, made snide comments under his breath. But as the training went on and he started to like, push back at me, like he was kind of rude about it at points. But I was like, whatever, I don't have a choice but to deal with you. And so I just kept listening and I kept empathizing and just kept doing the work. And by the end of 6 days, he was sold, like 100% in.
That's
And it
awesome.
got to a point where I was asked to do a presentation, like a panel discussion on restorative justice
Mhm.
and trauma-informed schools, and I couldn't do it. And so I was like, I'm going to call him up. And I called him up and I said, hey, could you do this talk for me? I think you're the right guy. And he went and did a talk in favor of trauma-informed restorative schools.
That's powerful
Same
because
guy that
Wow.
started rolling his eyes at me,
yeah,
Yeah, that's
you know?
amazing.
that's
So don't
amazing.
forget, like your naysayers could become your biggest fans.
That's
And
That's
great.
great. That's a
Golden.
really good advice.
Well, and Elena, you're a rock star, actually.
Oh,
You're asking the question, but you're actually really good at building community because I know that you've been doing, as a parent, you've been building community with your school for years and years. So I'm glad that you're adding to your toolbox, but you're already doing amazing work. So
thank you. I appreciate that. I do think relationship is building relationships is how I really was able to get what I needed for my kids to and make some changes, minor ones in the schools and just having, yeah, where I live in upstate New York, and we actually I didn't even know these existed, but we live in villages. So there's like villages and then villages go to schools, but where my family lives is outside of a village, but we go to a school in a village. Um, and it's definitely a different mentality the people inside the village have to outsiders. So just trying to get an in with the school and just the people within the village, because we live on a little farm, so we're not inside the village, but we got our little ins now, and we're building community within our little village. So, but yeah, I think we're all meant for relationships. So in community. So I think I'm really going to enjoy your book and learning more about this. So thank you, Joe.
thank you. Thanks for reading it.
Yeah, I'm
there
excited.
are two other questions that are from people who aren't here but wanted to ask. One was, what if a student is like violent or dangerous? Would this restorative practice work for really super violent, dangerous children? What do we do when we have that going on?
I don't know that I've ever met a violent, dangerous child. I've met children who are in fight or flight and scared out of their minds. I just can't classify that as dangerous. They're children,
Yeah.
and even all 5'3" of me, I'm not worried. And so I think I'd go back to Ross Greene's work. So while Ross Greene himself does not consider his work a restorative practice, I do.
Mhm.
And so I think if you've got a child that is quote unquote violent and dangerous, you need an ALSUP, an assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. You need to start doing a plan B to find out what is up with that kid and what's getting in their way. That's it. There's, and in the meanwhile, let's keep them safe. Let's keep them in relationship. Let's not make our expectations exceed their cognitive skills, and then they won't be violent or problems.
Right.
It's
And they
simple.
will have those
It's a
skills
formula.
later, eventually, right? Like it's not that they're never ever going to have the skills. I mean, development's going to depend on the child, but so important. I really am glad that you
And what are we doing to those children? What are the environments and circumstances you are putting them in? Like, this is something we love to do in this country, is that we will put people in a circumstance where they don't do well and then criticize them for how well they do. It's like, wait, you created the circumstances and then you want to criticize somebody for how they behave when they got there.
Exactly.
That's like set them on fire and then criticize how they burn.
Being very, yeah.
If the kid's being that violent, what kind of, I bet he's not like that all the time.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
what are the circumstances you are putting that child in that are causing that? And a lot of educators like, yeah, that's just one of those things.
I know we could go on about this, but in our program, we talk about this quite a bit, but having a really solid safety plan that's a gentle, compassionate safety plan, right? That's not about restraint and seclusion and all of that.
Violent kids are kids that don't feel safe.
Excellent.
That's the question mark.
They're
Why do they
scared.
not feel safe?
They're not defiant, they're scared. They're just, their
Yes.
amygdala is going, wah, wah, wah. So, yeah. And then the last question is, parents, what can parents do in schools? Like, what should parents be doing when they're trying to raise their child in a more trauma-informed way, but the school is super punitive and they have these really strict rules and things? Like, how can they advocate for their own children?
Yeah, I wish there was a one size fits all answer to that. And I'm gonna,
just some quick tips for parents.
I think one is stay regulated.
Mm-hmm.
Close.
So hard.
This I'm gonna steal from
Mama Bear.
I'm gonna steal this one from Amelia and Emily Nagoski's book Burnout, which I know is written for women, but I love it. And so in that book, they talk about recognizing that the stress and the stressor are different. Close your stress cycle so that you've got the energy to go back to that school and deal with that principal tomorrow. Don't let that stress cycle burn you out. Close your stress cycle. And by the way, read Emily and Amelia's book. Which I thought was great.
So important and so hard. And I find myself as a parent, I have endless empathy and compassion, and my son could be ripping everything off the walls in my house and doing horrible things, and I can still stay calm. But when an adult is hurting my child, I have a very hard time staying calm. So
your brain is wired to protect your kid.
Exactly. And so I think this is really good advice. And this is why a huge part of everything we do is about self-care, self-compassion, Kristen Neff's work, all of
that. Oh yeah, Kristen Neff's, yeah, totally.
And she has a new book out. I don't know if you've seen it, Fierce Self-Compassion. Have you seen it?
I haven't.
It's the mother bear energy, part of self-compassion. That it's okay
to
stand up for yourself. You don't have to be bullied. You can stand up for yourself and still have compassion for yourself and for others. It's really beautiful. I think you would like it.
And I've definitely gotten away from this word self-care.
Yeah, it's kind of a taboo in schools. I just say self-wellness.
Wellness is that. Wellness, I think.
And self-compassion. Those are the words I prefer to use. Yeah. If you tell a teacher, do more self-care, I think they're probably going to throw something.
Teachers just sort of, and personally, I think self-care is super important, period.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not going to deny that. But when self-care has become weaponized against teachers, because basically, like, we're going to give you a self-care workshop, but we're not going to lessen the stress you're under.
I know.
No, it's just mean.
I show this. Yeah, I always show them in my program. I show the teachers and the parent trainers that little video about the girl with the little fish. She's holding a fish. The fish is still alive, and she and her dad have pulled this fish out of the water. She's holding it, and the fish is going, and she's going, "It's okay, fish. It's okay, fish." And I'm like, you can do self-care as much as you want, but if you don't put a person back in an environment where they can survive,
right,
that's not going to help that person. So we can't, it's okay, fish, our teachers and our students. We can't tell them do more self-care and it's all going to be well. If we have violent schools where they're having violence done for them because of their neurodiversity or whatever else makes them different, or being Black and brown, or whatever is going on in that community that's happening to them, we can't self-care our way out of that. That's important, but we've got to also have systemic change. So
yeah, I can imagine, and I can only speak just because it's Pride Month. If you're an educator and you're going into a school that's super homophobic, filled with microaggressions, there ain't a self-care workshop on the planet that's going to make you feel better.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. That's my point. And that's why it's like, and I got into it with another parent coach in another group, not in my group, but she was saying her response to what we need to do to help the educators in Texas and the parents in Texas was, she's doing this breathing exercise and saying, just say, I'm safe. I'm like, I don't think we need to be telling them they're safe right now. It's the timing. they're not feeling safe. And so we need to acknowledge that, you know? So we need to create safety as at the same time that we're doing these practices. So anyway, our time is way over. I thank you for staying here and being
Thanks for
patient
having
with
me.
us. It's been a beautiful hour and a half with you. I hope everyone has found this helpful. Go check out Joe's book, follow all his channels, and hopefully we can have him back again sometime. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.
Have
Thanks,
a good
Joe.
night.